Ever since the rise of diesel engines during the 1950s and 60s, the sight of a steam engine in operation on a main line has become a special, uncommon experience. An experience that isn't very easy to replicate anywhere else. Thanks to various preservation groups and heritage lines, most rail fans may be able to witness at least one operating steam engine in their lifetime. Some people might be luckier and catch two steam engines, usually in the form of a double header. Even rarer still is the triple header, which, as you can guess, consists of three engines. And if you are somehow able to catch even more than that, well then congratulations, you've basically won the rail fanning jackpot at that point. Especially in today's day and age, seeing that many steam engines on the move at once is pretty much impossible. So if I told you that in 1922, over 20 steam engines traveled the US at once, you'd probably think that I was crazy. But it did happen at one point in that year, and it was a little something known as the Prosperity Special.
Number 66, Pacific Coast Express, now leaving for San Bernardino, Riverside, Anaheim, Azusa, Cucamonga, Pasadena, and Los Angeles. Order cars only. Leaving on track 2.
Our story begins in the year 1921. World War I has long since ended, and it's time for the Roaring Twenties. While America was still going through an economic slump, the Southern Pacific Railroad decided to keep their chin up and placed an order for 50 heavy freight engines for use in the Tehachapi Mountains of California. The engines in question were all 210-2 types, known as the F4 class. The manufacturer? Baldwin Locomotive Works. Even though there were several builders of steam engines at the time, Baldwin was among the biggest and best. Beginning in the early months of 1922, they set to work building the 50 engines needed over a period of several months following. While the building process went without issue, there was one big problem standing in the way. Baldwin had their factory in Pennsylvania, and Southern Pacific needed the engines to work in California. So to get there, the engines would all have to take a cross-country trip for delivery. Now, the practice of moving newly built engines long distances has been something that modern railroads have become more or less familiar with, to the point where they can move engines all over the world if they wanted to. But this was the 1920s, and this sort of thing wasn't nearly as commonplace, let alone on such a grand scale. This is where Baldwin president Samuel M. Vauclain had an idea. Instead of taking only a few engines at a time, just take 20 of them at once. And it really was a good idea. Not only would it save a lot of time, but it could double as a publicity stunt, because who would ignore something like that? Thus, the authorities of both Baldwin and Southern Pacific agreed to the idea, and in late May, the Prosperity Special was born. The railroad industry had never seen anything like it. 20 engines all lined up, measuring over a half a mile long. As predicted, it did get a lot of attention. Many people across Pennsylvania came to watch its departure, including several executives from the Southern Pacific. Even President Warren Harding sent his best wishes to the train by telegraph. And on May 27, 1922, with a final speech given by Samuel Vauclain, the Prosperity Special was off on its cross-country journey. Although the engines were fresh out of the factory, they would need some assistance along their travels. In their inaugural departure from the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Eddystone, Pennsylvania, they were escorted by none other than the Pennsylvania Railroad themselves. Though it wasn't just going to be a straight shot. Like I said before, the Prosperity Special was not only a train, but also a publicity stunt. Therefore, it made many stops along the way for photo shoots and public viewings, as well as traveling only during the day and settling in at night. That's why the engines were all given special lettering, along with having their headlights covered to prevent any attempted stealing or vandalism. After several days on the road, the Special reached Altoona, where it would have to traverse one of the most famous railroading icons in the world, the Horseshoe Curve. It had always been a relatively tough climb, usually needing about 2 or 3 helpers for an average train. And of course, this was no average train. In Altoona, extra engines were added for the climb up the Allegheny Mountains. While the exact amount is unknown, it is said that no fewer than 6 engines were needed to get the Special up and over. Now that is hitting the railfan jackpot. With hundreds of thousands of pounds of tractive effort and a show that one could only dream about, the Prosperity Special made it across the Horseshoe Curve and continued further west. After more viewing stops in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, the Special reached East St. Louis in early June. It stayed here for a while, receiving more public attention, and its trek along the Pennsylvania Railroad had ended. From here on, it was transferred to other routes westbound. The Special departed St. Louis along the route of the St. Louis Southwestern Railroad, better known as the Cotton Belt. Similar to the Pennsylvania, this leg of the journey also included many publicity stops. However, this time, things were fairly easier. There weren't any wide main lines or steep, rugged mountain grades. Instead, there was just the relatively smooth lands of the Southwest prairies and deserts. Therefore, fewer engines were needed, and the Special rolled along with little to no reported obstacles. Better still, the Cotton Belt was the shortest leg of the trip, as within just a few days, the Special was swapped over again, this time in Corsicana, Texas. For the third and final leg of the journey, the Special traveled along the rails of the one who started it all, Southern Pacific. Yet again, conditions weren't too difficult as the engines coasted along the Sunset Route through the cities and towns of New Mexico, Arizona, and finally California. After several weeks of traveling along 3 different railroads, almost 3,000 miles coast to coast, the Prosperity Special made its final stop in Southern Pacific's Taylor Yard in Los Angeles. Upon arrival in their new home, some of the engines worked in the Tehachapi Mountains as planned in Northern California, while others worked around the Sacramento area. As for the other 30 engines that weren't part of the Special, they were allegedly transported in smaller batches in the weeks following. Despite a national railroad worker strike a few weeks after their arrival, and the subsequent depression and the war that followed in the later decades, the F4 class of freight engines did their job well up until the end of steam in the late 1950s. Sadly, none of these engines are preserved. They all met the fate of scrap. However, even though they're different types, 2 other Southern Pacific 210-2s were preserved, and can still be found in Illinois and Texas. So are there any other engines of the Prosperity Special still around today? Well, there's a very small chance, as most of the engines that pulled the train are unknown as of now, and even the few that we do know of just lead to dead ends when you look them up on Google. Which brings me to the one striking thing about this train, the fact that it's so obscure. There's a good chance that this is your first time ever hearing about it, and the only fragments we have left to tell the tale are the various photos and articles scattered across the internet. In my several months of researching this, I had to jump around between articles, forum posts, and railroadpicturearchives.net, to the point where any sort of minor discovery felt like a blessing from the heavens. I know I've said this with many other things before, but it's really kind of sad how such a grand and unique event gradually became forgotten over time. Because of this, there are still so many mysteries regarding it. Did the Pennsylvania really use more than 6 engines to get the Special up the curve? What engines did they use? Are any of them preserved? That's the interesting thing about all this. Because there are so many unanswered questions, it sort of leaves us to fill in the blanks. Just like so many other mysteries out there, maybe one day the mysteries will be solved. Maybe one day there will be some groundbreaking discovery. But whatever comes next, at least the Prosperity Special won't be completely forgotten. Because if there's one thing for sure about it, it's that there won't ever be another train quite like it. And that's a pretty good status for a train that's 100 years old.
Through the plains and valleys, across the great divide, the white man brought his thunder from the other side. Burning slow